So, thanks, the four of you. I've been watching our audience carefully, and you kept them awake, which is great after such a good lunch. So we've got half an hour or so for discussion. Now, remember at the beginning I said, unfortunately, we'd lost John Firth from Acclimatise at very short notice, and that might be a pity because he would have covered the area that sort of bridges that region of the pipeline between the suppliers and providers and the users. We had, however, a very good example, I thought, from Dickie Whitaker, specifically in the insurance sector of specifically that delivery to the user's needs. So we've got one good example. But oh, and let me just recap a bit while you're thinking, because I want to go back for a few minutes to see if we can fill the Acclimatise idea with other examples that you may have experience of bridging across to the user. Stephen brought us up to date with some of the issues that the scientists are working on in delivering, greater accuracy, greater detail, in coming down line to the impacting events rather than just the standard climate variables. So talking about floods, droughts, and soil erosion, he made the beginnings of a plea for some integration across these modelling groups to maybe an EU-wide climate programme. From Alan, we had the description of the beginnings of this very important initiative of gathering together such knowledge that exists in Europe and indeed worldwide, to quality control that, to standardize and to deliver in ways that can be overcome some of the challenges that Daniela was talking about, which is delivering that information for users. And then Daniela bringing us back, in a sense, to reality about these issues that are bound to be threaded through all this. Accessibility, legality, viability, cost, human skills and knowledge, etc., etc. Before I open up more generally, can I just see whether there is the ability here of us to sort of fill the gap that John Firth may have left here? Any of you working in that area that Acclimatise does of delivering information to users now, either at the SME level or larger level, meeting their needs, and can perhaps sort of fill us in on this by a comment or two? I'm just looking around the room to see if anyone would like to, make some comments on that area that hasn't been covered apart from the insurance sector. See one hand there from Climate Exchange, isn't it? Just wait for if you could wait for the microphone and just say who you are and where you come from. Yep. Thanks.
My name is Raggy Lowe. I'm the project manager for Climate Exchange, which is a centre of expertise funded by the Scottish Government. And we provide effectively a support service, I suppose, but it's a research and science support for policy making on mitigation and on adaptation. And so we don't support businesses, so I can't fill Acclimatise's shoes in that respect. But I wanted just to touch on one issue that we have faced, which I think is pertinent also in terms of the challenges and barriers that were touched on, which is that the questions that users, if we just want to call them that, aren't necessarily ones that the science can answer. One of the questions that we were asked was around spatial planning policy and building regulations, and whether in Scotland windstorms were going to get more frequent and more intense, and whether planning policy should therefore take that into account, and whether the construction industry should be forced through regulation to adapt, implement new, more costly building design. And that's not a question that is readily answered by the state of the science at the moment. So it was just to flag that's another challenge, I think, that user questions aren't necessarily a good fit always with what the science can tell us.
Yes, okay, thanks very much. So just looking for any other comment of that kind that John Firth might have covered, just for a few minutes, and then I'll come to any particular questions on the presentations we've had. Yes.
Yes, Efraín Feliu from Tecnalia, a research and technology organization in Spain. We are working in research projects, FP7 and Horizon 2020, about adaptation mainly in cities, but also with some sectors. And I have a question regarding how balancing the accuracy of climate projections or simulations, or as you were mentioning, and understanding or assessing climate sensitivity, and to which extent or where do we have to put the accent when an end user like a city is asking for, well, uncertainty analysis or climate projections, etc. To which extent is that more important than making them understand their climate vulnerability, which doesn't have to, it requires a deeper understanding of their city system in relation to climate variables, and perhaps the accuracy on climate simulations or projections will have to come later. Would you agree about this, or how dealing with balancing these two things?
Okay, well, let's pick up that point. It could be, I guess, either to Stephen or Alan specifically, or Daniela. You work on this area as well. I think the question is whether, when you've got users like this, do you see your priority as clarifying with them their understanding of their sensitivity to climate now, and where the key vulnerabilities are, prior to discussing with them some of the longer-term issues, which is how changing climate may impact on that. Stephen, do you want to have a crack at that?
Thank you, Martin. It's a tough question. In a way, I think your question encapsulates many of the challenges that climate services generally are trying to raise. So I'll start by speaking as a climate scientist, and then maybe I'll give some experience of a climate service from the Met Office. So as a climate scientist, we have to continually be careful to make sure that any information that is provided is traceable and defensible. So it would be inappropriate to supply information on a scale, as you spoke about, that is not defensible. So that's the first part of my answer. The second part of your question, I think, was around, should I just tell them that the climate sensitivity is 3.7 and, that's it, my job's done? Or should I talk with them about their vulnerabilities? That seems to me to be a question about how should climate services be done? So the kind of experience we've got, we have a big project with the Chinese at the moment, with the China Meteorological Authority, who are the main suppliers of climate services in China. It's clear that we, the Met Office, do not understand the kind of services that China might need and what their particular vulnerabilities are. So that side of it is very much the CMA, the China Meteorological Authority's role. And our role is to try and provide the best climate advice that sits underneath that. I'm not sure if I've really addressed your question head on, but I think that's a start perhaps for others to follow.
Alan, do you want to have a crack?
Again, just trying to understand the question. I mean, I think certainly from a climate science point of view, as you know, this issue of climate sensitivity, which is a measure of whether we are converging on with the climate models as to what the impact of doubling CO2 would be. It has become a kind of touchstone scientific question, but it's not, to me anyway, from a personal point of view, it's never seemed to be a particularly relevant thing for users to think about. It's really to try and understand better the climate system and whether the models are really able to converge and reduce their uncertainty. I think from the point of view of individual users, they're more interested in the specific of their site and their needs in the near future. And it's one of the reasons I think in C3S the seasonal timescale is very important, because it's the short range of climate prediction, but it's still the time range in which the initial conditions for the prediction are very, very important. And so we have much a shot at least of reducing the uncertainty. And to me, at least, it's an opportunity to provide information that's specific, more specific. But I think within the climate science world, they will still want to understand the climate models sufficiently to know whether the sensitivity, which is kind of measure of the convergence of those models, is there. But I'm not sure that it's necessarily relevant for users, and maybe that was underpinning your question.
Okay, Dickie, and then I'm going to widen the discussion to cover, not just this issue of acclimatise and the gap there. Dickie, and then Daniela. So be prepared, if you will, to ask any questions or comment on what you've heard so far after lunch. Dickie.
I was going to try and answer the question in a slightly different way, actually. So if I understood your problem correctly, and this is a problem that I face a lot. So the first thing is the users don't always understand what the right question is to ask. I mean, I think that's going to be a common problem. And I think at least part of the role that we have is one of education. So we try and say, well, okay, you may think that's the one question you've got, but actually you need to look at this as well. So there's an educational function or a consulting function to lead them into asking the right questions. And actually, I happen to know John and his company quite well. That's certainly one of the things they do with some of their clients. And I think that understanding the current weather patterns and its uncertainty is a great help in trying to manage the future. So I think that you have to sort of lead them along a path that is largely educational, so they're going to end up in the right place at some point in the future.
Okay, thanks, Daniela.
So I think, does it work? In addition to what I said before, I think it's important that today's infrastructure is still functioning, which is not always the case. So even if we do not look into the long-term planning for a city, for example, then it is, of course, it is important that under the current weather variability, the city is still functioning. So, and I think when the end user realizes that there's probably something to do, it is important to be a bit more practical and consider whatever is needed in order to rebuild or to plan under today's condition can last a little bit longer than even under climate change conditions. So what I mean is that it is important to have the educational part stretch to those consultancies who are already working with the cities or the end users and make sure that in their methodologies and in their methods, the latest information on the climate change side is introduced. And sometimes the uncertainty which we introduce here is not the largest uncertainty compared to all other uncertainties which are somehow have to be considered in this planning process. So I think it's also important to be transparent and very clear, but also not to overemphasize the unknown future from a climate change point of view. I think that's a message which I want to give here.
Okay, thanks. So I'm now looking around the room for comments or questions on anything this afternoon. Just a show of hands so far as to who would like, and then I can sort of pace a... So I've got 4 so far. So let's take the far side here, and then second from the front, and then 2 over there. Please.
Thank you. My name is Daniel Kull. I'm from the World Bank Group. I just wanted to build on some of the comments that came up here. I think, as you know, the World Bank, we are all about poverty reduction in low and middle income countries. So it's a very sort of different setting from mainstream Europe, if you will. It's interesting to see this notion of sometimes actually the users, maybe they don't even know they're users, they don't know what to ask for. Or maybe they know they need something, but they don't really know how to sort of explain that or describe that in a way that providers can understand and can work with them. So I'd like to also push a bit for the role of intermediaries. And I don't want to talk about purveyors, because these are not organizations that are supplying the climate services, but rather they're sort of assisting in that communication aspect. NGOs are great leaders in this area, and there's a number of other organizations that can do this sort of thing. So I think when I saw the word purveyor up there in this morning's presentations, I was a bit sort of put off by that. Maybe it's just an English interpretation for me, but I like the intermediary role a bit too, to sort of make that link. And also, I don't think providers certainly have an obligation to discuss with the users and sort of work with them in terms of education and reaching an understanding of what kind of services are needed. But I don't think it should fully fall on the shoulders of the providers themselves. There has to be a group effort on this. Linked to that, we, together with the WMO and USAID, are developing a authoritative, for lack of better word, guidance on assessing the socioeconomic benefits of weather and climate services, which is actually going to be launched at the World Meteorological Congress coming up in May this year. So for us, what's been interesting as we put that together with a number of different authors and editors from around the world, many of them from Europe, is how this notion of understanding the socioeconomic benefits isn't just an economic exercise or a climate exercise or a weather exercise. It's again fostering this engagement between user and provider. We heard this morning a lot from these private companies that are very advanced in terms of using climate services. It's all about adding value to their business, of course. But on the other side, from the user perspective, it's also about adding value to society or to what you're doing. So I think this conversation that is had between users and providers needs to take into account where value can be added on both sides of the equation. So a provider of climate service won't really be doing justice to anything by just sort of targeting an area where they think they're adding value. But if they haven't discussed with the users, are they really adding societal or economic value, then why bother doing it? That's a bit of an old-fashioned approach, and as we move forward, everyone has limited resources, so how do we optimize those resources to add the most value to society in general? It's not really a question, but I'd be interesting to hear from some of the panelists how they take socioeconomic benefit assessments into account when planning the services that they provide.
Okay, thanks. I'll take that mainly as a comment, but leave that last question hanging with all the panelists, which was, what is their response to the question? How far do they take on board? You said the socioeconomic what? Benefits of the services they might provide as a closing statement. But continue with Paul in the second row in front, and then I've got two more. Any others apart from these two? Thank you. Okay, yep. Thanks.
Thank you, Martin. Two quick questions. Dickie, quite a specific one for you, and if you can't answer it, I understand. Do you know anything about the insurance industry's risk assessment called 1 in 200? Can you talk anything about that? I thought you would. Can you say something about that, and which is really translating risk into a metric that is easy to use, as I understand it? And could that be more widely applicable to corporations and others in assessing climate risk? And then just a question for the panel. It strikes me that one of the challenges in this room is business models. There's a lot of publicly funded entities struggling with, are we a publicly funded entity giving things for free, or are we a business? And what do you think about that? And Daniela brings up a lot of the issues around it, around need for resources, legal things, open data, closed data. And I just wonder if anyone's got any thoughts about that, particularly in the world of open source data, is that there is then Creative Commons licenses where stuff is used for, if for public good it's free, if for private profit you pay, and whether anyone's exploring that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So collecting together with your sort of collection of comments, as it were, I'll give you a few minutes to respond to this issue of business models and how far you can learn from that, together with the question of how do you measure socioeconomic benefits of the services you're providing. But specifically, Dickie, if you can, briefly, this question about 1 in 200.
Sure. Can I try and add the other part of the question a little bit at the same time?
Just leave that for the moment, if you can, fine. Because I just want to make sure that we cover people this side.
So there are several ways of giving metrics that can be used for decision making. So the insurance industry uses somewhere between 1 in 100 and 1 in 200. It depends on the jurisdiction. There's a legal requirement in Europe to be able to hold capital to a 1 in 200 year event, or the equivalent percentile, of course. And we use probability density functions as mostly the outputs we use. However, we also use deterministic scenarios, some of which are stochastically varied. So there's a whole range of outputs that we use, and we have to use all of those outputs depending on the function that they're being used for. It depends if it's at the board level making decisions, if it's at a sort of setting capital by the people that do that in insurance companies. So I think the same types of decisions outside the insurance industry require the same range of outputs and tools. There is some stuff going on in Sendai at the moment, for instance, which is saying that actually new accounting standards are being encouraged that are going to, and I think the word encourage is the right one maybe, that all corporations will start holding numbers of materiality on catastrophic exposure, particularly a 1 in 100 year sort of definition. Now, we haven't got time to talk about it today, but there are some issues about using these point estimates. And I've had discussions with some of the architects of that to say, actually, is that the right thing we're doing? Because in the insurance industry, we're trying to get away from that to look at the full uncertainty distribution. So,
Okay, thank you. Now, there was a hand up right at the back, towards where I'm pointing. Yes, if you could. And then I think I saw Rob Swart, and then 3 this side. And then I think that will be it for probably. We'll see. Here we go. Please.
Hello, my name is Charlotte Cederbom. I'm working at a national authority in Sweden, and we are actually both a provider and a user of climate services, and we work with both research and consultancy work. And I enjoyed your talk, Daniela. I think you really pointed to many key issues that we see. And one minor thing, but still I would like to lift it up, because you did and nobody else has done. We really find it difficult to find people, new people, especially young people, to carry this work on with a right profile. What would you send with us? What would the ideal person be? What would the ideal profile be to carry on this work, to both really be able to see the needer's point of view, but also be able to carrying this in a quite cross-thematic way? Thanks.
Okay, Daniela, do you want a quick further stab at that? What's the ideal profile of your most skilled provider?
I think the deep knowledge in one discipline is very important, with a scientific way of, or let's say, strategic way of thinking. And I think the people need a lot of enthusiasm and openness, flexibility and communication skills, curiosity and open for new areas. I think this is more important than solving the Navier-Stokes equation or running a hydrological model. So I think it is very important not to flatten the education into too many interdisciplinary parts. So I think the very disciplinary route is important. It doesn't matter if it's in socio-economic or natural science, it doesn't matter, or communication, but I think the enthusiasm and the fun is needed.
Okay, Stephen, you can add to that. I'm sorry, Alan. It just got you worried there for a minute.
I very much agree with Daniela. I think my previous life I was head of a research council in the UK, and one of the key issues there was to understand exactly this question, how to really generate environmental scientists and practitioners in the future that were really able to be multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary. And the mint with the whole analogy came up, that what we don't want are people who are broad but not actually deep in anything. But I mean, there are ways to stimulate this. I mean, for example, having joint supervision in universities between 2 specialist supervisors on a multidisciplinary project, where the student is getting deep experience in both areas, because quite demanding on the student. But I think in that way they don't fall between the cracks of not having a real discipline. While I've got the microphone, I'd like to just respond to the first question. I'm not fully going to answer the question, but I'm going to make I hope a relevant point about the socio-economic information. For the Copernicus Climate Change Service, it's very much a topic that we're investigating, how to draw in actually socio-economic data sets that would be relevant. It's a lot of the work on essential climate variables and all of that stuff is very physical science based and a bit almost traditional, let's say. But we would, I think, greatly benefit from drawing in reliable and extensive socioeconomic data sets as well to bring alongside those. And I don't we don't have the answer yet exactly how to do that, but it's a live issue of debate as we develop the Copernicus service. So, I mean, if you have ideas and inputs, we would greatly value that.
Okay, thanks. So I'm not sure if it's going to be possible, but I want to see if I can pick up the three hands here, take them together. So keep them brief as you can. I think it was Rob Swart, Andre Joel, and then there was a person right on the corner there. If you could keep your comments or your questions brief, I'll take them all together, and then I'll fold them into last questions to the panel. Rob.
Thank you, Martin. Rob Zwart from the Netherlands. I have a question for Daniela as well. I think you stressed, and rightly so, the importance of evaluating climate services, the quality of climate services. But I felt that you had very much a supplier point of view. And my question is basically, how do you see the involvement of the user? Because in the end, it's the user who decides about climate services. If he doesn't like them, he goes to another provider. And you can think of putting reviews online. There are different methods to do that. But what is your view on how to involve the user community in evaluating climate services?
Okay, thank you. I'm going to hold that for the moment. And Andre Joel?
Yeah, thanks very much, Andre Joel, European Environment Agency. I'd like to reflect on the idea of having a European-wide climate projection approach or method. I can see at least three reasons to do that. One is transboundary issues. For example, under the Floods Directive, countries or actually regions will need to report how they deal with climate change in transboundary river basins. The second reason could be there are many challenges which are common across Europe, particularly also in regions which don't have the capacity to have their own climate modeling in place. A third reason could be issues are similar in cities. The heavy precipitation events you mentioned, for example, actually in Copenhagen, it happened in 2011. So there's a high need for similar cities to see how they deal with these types of events also in the future. But the question would then be, why don't we have currently such a European-wide projection system in place?
Yes, okay, thanks very much. Holding that for the end. And the final point, please.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm Piero Pellizzaro from Climalia. We are like a startup company providing services on climate adaptation and resilience. We also have like a strategic partnership with Acclimatize, with John Firth, so we do work with Acclimatize. We do work more on urban area, but then there is a connection between urban and private, and is linking what you said, Daniela, and this morning say about the open data. When we talk about open data to have climate projection, this is one of the limits we see at the moment, because when there is an absence of a defined regulatory framework at the national level, like in Italy, we don't have a national adaptation strategy, for example, yet, and we don't have like a regional adaptation plan. We have only a couple of cities with adaptation plan. How we can require to the private sector to move to adaptation, because the risk is not defined. So also I think that the open data system should be at the national level or at the European level to get access to this information. Otherwise there is private sector asking for money, is the big data company, so we can also become a big data company, like a startup company, collecting information directly by users. Because when we were in Devon for a Met Office workshop on climate services last November, one of your colleagues said we need to have reversing map. So going to the end users, ask them what they need. Normally, who delivering the climate projection, they do on their own purpose and not going to the end users. So this is, I think, it's linking to a regulatory framework well defined, even, and I'm finished. Also, I think we need certification scheme over like resilient infrastructures, because then we can have indicators, then we can have more like cost-benefit analysis that is missing, so that we can define. And certification scheme is also always move the market faster than the other. Otherwise, it's on voluntary purpose, and then it's CSR. Thanks.
Right. Thanks very much. So, half a minute each, just to sort of close on any comments you wish. Daniela, you might like to answer the point about involvement of your profile of the user as opposed to the supplier. Stephen, you might like to respond to Andre Joel once again about why we don't have already an EU climate program, and Dickie and Alan on any of the points, whether it's your ideal profile, that can one learn from business models out there in the non-climate area, or socioeconomic. How do you measure the benefits of the services that you're aiming to provide? Those are the more general points that came up. But very briefly, if you would, just a couple of short sentences. Daniela, let's start with you.
I'd like to answer to Rob, and I think it is not the duty of the providers to evaluate the success of the climate service product. And it is not the output which needs to be evaluated, it's the impact of the service which has to be evaluated and verified. And I think there's a large involvement of users, but also of some independent people somewhere in between. I don't know who this is, but I think it is important to have some independent agencies or, I don't know, consultancies, I don't know yet. But there will be a session on the EMS in Sofia on how to develop criteria to evaluate climate services, and I think this will be a topic in the next years which will come, and we will meet there more often.
Okay, thank you. Stephen?
Yes, so an EU climate projection system. Just to be clear, there is a very joined up and integrated programme of climate science research in Europe, and that's generated fantastic improvements to models and understanding and contributions to the IPCC. It's that final step to convert simulations into projections that we don't have. Why don't we have it? I think we've kind of been hearing the reasons all day, that different nations are at different stages in developing their adaptation plans, and so there are different levels of readiness for this. I do also honestly think it's the poor relation of climate science at the moment, the bit at the end that actually delivers the forecasts, if you like. And I think that the desire for climate services is just the incentive we need to mobilise the community.
Okay, thank you. Dickie?
So to Daniel's point, yes, I completely agree. Intermediaries are absolutely vital, particularly in emerging marketplaces, and we should use them more often. They're undervalued in almost every case I've seen before. On business models, I think there's a really interesting dichotomy between this regulated environment and the sort of open and Creative Commons type of environment. We've got to let it go. We cannot try and regulate all of this stuff. It just won't happen. So it's really, really important. And I think Danielle made some really good points. I was very impressed that all those things you came up with are all the points we've had to deal with, but we can deal with them. And we don't need lots of bureaucracy and administration to make them happen. With two exceptions. So actually you need some sort of constraint around that. We're doing some stuff on legal contracts. We've hired a firm of international lawyers. If everybody does that, we'll have 1,000 different contracts. Why don't we see if we can try and get one that work across this area for the whole of, at least the whole of Europe. Actually, we have ones for the USA as well. And on lastly, I think, and so evaluation of services, of course, it has to be the user. They have to be educated. The buyer should be aware that's when to do it. And lastly, to Charlotte's point, don't worry, there are plenty of keen, bright, enthusiastic people out there that will take on this and make businesses out of it. And the only thing is, they don't have to be young. They just like to think like they're young, like me.
Good, okay. And well done. Alan, finally.
I will be very short, just to remind everybody that at least the Copernicus climate change service data will be free and open to everyone. So at least from that particular part of the pipeline, there is no question about open data.
Okay, well, I haven't been able to get a word in edgeways, which is great. That's how it should be. So thanks for your questions and your comments, and let's put our hands together for the four speakers. Thank you.